There are moments when a human being is invited into a room and told, without words, exactly how small they are expected to be. A room where one chair is raised and another place is left empty. A room where the floor itself becomes a message. A room where power is not spoken, only arranged. Many of us have known rooms like this. Not always with walls of stone or flags of empire. Sometimes it is a workplace, sometimes a courtroom, sometimes a classroom, sometimes a nation that tells you to be grateful for the space you are allowed to occupy, as long as you do not stand too tall. And in those rooms, the question is never what you will say. The question is how you will sit, or whether you will be allowed to sit at all. This story begins in such a room, but it is not really about a room. It is about posture. It is about dignity. It is about what happens when a person understands that the smallest act of acceptance can echo across generations. Before there were borders drawn by strangers, before ships crossed oceans with chains in their holds, there were people who understood that standing upright was not a metaphor. It was survival. It was memory. It was inheritance. Our ancestors knew that once you agree to be placed lower, you are taught to remain there, and that lesson does not stop with you. It travels quietly to your children, and their children, and into the bones of a people. So this is not simply a story about a queen. It is not only about a war, or a negotiation, or a throne. It is about a woman who was measured the moment she entered the world. A woman who learned early that she would never be given permission to be equal. A woman who understood that if she accepted the posture offered to her, her people would be forced to live with that posture long after she was gone. This is a story about someone who decided that standing straight was worth the cost. If you have ever been told to wait your turn when no turn was coming, this story is for you. If you have ever been praised for being quiet when silence was the price of belonging, this story is for you. If you have lived long enough to see how easily history forgets those who refuse to bow, this story is for you. Listen closely, not for dates or titles, but for the weight of a choice. Because before this woman became a name written in books, she was a human being who understood one thing clearly. Once you accept the ground as your seat, the world will never raise the chair. And she was not willing to live, or let her people live, that way. She entered the world already struggling for breath. In the year 1583, in the land of Ndongo, a child was born into the royal family with the cord of life wrapped tightly around her neck. For many, this would have been a moment of fear. For the Mbundu people, it was something else entirely. They believed that when a child arrives, bound in such a way, it means the spirit refused to come easily. It means the soul fought its way into this world. It means this person would never move through life quietly. They named her Nzinga. The name did not mean beauty. It did not mean peace. It meant to twist, to turn, to break free. A name like that is not given by accident. It is a warning. It tells the community that this child will bend what others think is fixed, that she will not accept the shape handed to her. A wise woman looked at the newborn and spoke words that would travel far beyond that day. She said the child would grow to carry the weight of many people, that her life would never belong only to herself. Nzinga was born into royalty, but not into ease. From the beginning, her body taught her what her life would later confirm. Survival would require strength, not permission. In many African communities, children are not raised as isolated individuals. They are raised as living threads in a larger fabric. Nzinga's birth was remembered, not because she was a princess, but because it felt like a sign. People watched her closely as she grew. They spoke quietly about her eyes, about how she observed before she spoke, about how she did not shrink. Even as a child, when elders looked her way, she did not cry easily, she did not submit easily, and she did not forget what she saw. For those who have lived long enough to understand what it means to be born into struggle, Nzinga's beginning feels familiar. Many of us arrived in a world that was not prepared to make space for us. Many of us were marked early, not with celebration, but with expectation. Expectation to endure. Expectation to adapt. Expectation to carry more than our share. Nzinga's life did not begin with a crown. It began with a test, and the lesson was simple, though not gentle. Breath would never be guaranteed. Standing upright would always require effort, and survival, when tied to dignity, would demand a price. She learned that before she ever learned to rule. From an early age, Nzinga learned what it meant to stand close to power without ever being invited to claim it. She was born into a royal household, surrounded by symbols of authority, ceremony, and command. But she was also born a daughter, and in the world she grew up in, that single fact quietly closed doors before she ever reached them. Her brothers were raised as heirs. They were spoken to as future rulers. Their mistakes were forgiven as part of becoming men. Nzinga watched all of this from the side. What she was given instead was something less obvious, but far more dangerous. Her father, King Nzinga, saw what others overlooked. He did not train Nzinga to wait. He trained her to observe. He allowed her to listen when leaders spoke. He let her sit near discussions where decisions were shaped, not announced. Nzinga learned that power rarely declares itself honestly. It disguises fear as authority. It hides weakness behind ceremony, and it often underestimates those it assumes will remain silent. She was taught to read and write by Portuguese missionaries. She learned their language not as an act of admiration, but as an act of defense. Words, she understood, could be weapons. Silence could be fatal. By learning how the Portuguese spoke, she learned how they thought. She learned how agreements were shaped to benefit one side. She learned how promises could sound generous while carrying traps beneath them. As a young woman, Nzinga also learned a harder truth. She was not allowed the luxury of error. When men failed, they were corrected. When women failed, they were erased. So she learned to prepare twice as much, to listen longer, and to speak only when her words could not be dismissed. She learned patience, not as weakness, but as discipline. This kind of childhood shapes a person in quiet ways. It sharpens attention. It builds memory. It teaches restraint without surrender. Many people listening to this story know this feeling well, knowing you must be better just to be considered equal, knowing that the margin for mistake is thin, and forgiveness thinner still. Nzinga did not grow up dreaming of a crown. She grew up understanding systems, and that understanding would later become more powerful than any title, because those who are trained on the edges often see what those at the center never notice, and when the moment comes to act, they do not hesitate. The collapse of Nzinga's family did not arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, carried by fear, suspicion, and the hunger for control. Her father, King Nzinga, had ruled with strength, but also with growing tension. The pressure from the Portuguese was constant. Agreements were broken. Boundaries were ignored. War strained the kingdom, and strain changes people. Eventually, the throne was taken not by wisdom, but by violence. Nzinga's brother overthrew their father and had him killed. Power passed not through responsibility, but through blood. And once that line was crossed, nothing within the royal household was safe anymore. The new king ruled as a man haunted by what he had done. He governed through fear, not trust. Anyone who reminded him of his crime became a threat. Family ties meant nothing when survival depended on silence. Nzinga watched as the royal house turned inward, consuming itself. The place that had once trained her to observe now taught her something harsher: power, without moral ground, devours even its own. Her brother's cruelty did not strengthen the kingdom. It weakened it. People lost faith. Advisors disappeared. Fear replaced loyalty. And the Portuguese waited, knowing that a divided house always falls more easily. There are moments when a person realizes that the structures meant to protect them are no longer real. Nzinga reached that moment early. She understood that lineage alone could not save a people, that blood ties offered no guarantee of justice, and that waiting for others to rule well was another form of surrender. This period marked a turning point inside her. Nzinga stopped believing in inherited order. She stopped assuming that authority carried wisdom, and she began preparing herself for a future where legitimacy would not be given, but taken. Many who hear this story recognize that moment, when the family, the institution, or the nation you trusted reveals its fractures. When you understand that survival will require choices no one prepared you to make. Nzinga did not act immediately. She did not rush toward the throne. She watched. She waited. And she learned exactly how fragile a kingdom becomes when fear replaces principle. By the time her brother's rule began to collapse under its own weight, Nzinga was no longer just a witness. She was ready. Because once you see power destroy what it claims to protect, you either accept the ruin or you prepare to build something else. The meeting in Luanda was called a peace conference, but peace was not what was being tested. Nzinga was sent to speak for her brother, the king who no longer trusted his own strength. He did not go himself. He sent his sister instead, knowing that if humiliation came, it would fall on her shoulders. When Nzinga entered the room, everything had already been decided by furniture. The Portuguese governor sat elevated in a chair meant to command the space. Nzinga was offered no chair at all, only a mat on the floor. The message was silent, but unmistakable. This was not a negotiation between equals. This was a lesson in placement. Many people would have accepted it. Many leaders would have chosen comfort over confrontation, believing that words could correct posture later. Nzinga understood something sharper. Once posture is accepted, words lose their power. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She did not ask for a chair. Instead, she gave a signal. One of her attendants knelt down, steady and still. Nzinga sat on the woman's back, lifting herself to the same height as the governor. Only then did she begin to speak. In that moment, the room changed. No treaty had been signed yet. No demand had been spoken. But Nzinga had already made her position clear. She was not there to beg. She was not there to kneel. She was there as the equal representative of a sovereign people. The Portuguese were forced to adjust, not because she threatened them, but because she refused to accept the role prepared for her. That single act traveled farther than any sentence spoken that day. It told every observer that dignity is not granted by power. It is claimed by those willing to carry its weight. For people who have lived under systems designed to keep them small, this moment resonates deeply. We know how often disrespect arrives quietly, disguised as protocol. We know how often we are told to accept small humiliations for the sake of progress. Nzinga rejected that logic completely. She showed that sometimes the most powerful response is not anger, but calm refusal, not loud protest, but unmovable presence. By choosing how she sat, Nzinga chose how history would remember her. And from that day forward, she was no longer simply a messenger, sent in another man's place. She had made herself impossible to overlook. Because when you refuse the ground, you force the world to look you in the eye. After the meeting in Luanda, the illusion of peace did not last long. The Portuguese returned to what they had always wanted: control, bodies, profit. They resumed their raids, seizing men, women, and children and marking them as property. They spoke of agreements while breaking them. They spoke of civilization while filling ships with human beings. Soon, their demands reached Nzinga directly. They wanted her to return what they called their escaped property. People who had fled bondage. People who had crossed into her protection, believing that a queen's word still meant something. Nzinga understood the danger of this moment immediately. If she complied, the raids might slow, her position might be recognized, her life might become easier. But she also understood something far more important. Once you agree to call your people property, there is no boundary left to defend. Her answer did not come wrapped in diplomacy. She said there were no slaves in her kingdom, not hidden ones, not borrowed ones, none. This was not a clever statement. It was a line drawn in the earth. By refusing that demand, Nzinga accepted everything that would follow: war, isolation, the loss of recognition, the threat to her life. She chose all of it knowingly. For many rulers, survival means compromise. For Nzinga, survival without dignity was not survival at all. That decision placed her outside the logic of empire. Empires understand submission and rebellion. They struggle to understand refusal, rooted in moral certainty. Nzinga was not negotiating terms. She was defining identity. This choice reshaped her life completely. It pushed her out of Ndongo and toward exile. It forced her to rebuild power without legitimacy, granted by Europeans. It turned her from a negotiator into a permanent obstacle. But it also did something else. It told her people that there was still a place where they were not merchandise, a place where their names mattered more than their price. Many listening today understand this kind of moment, when you realize that the cost of acceptance is too high, when survival offered by the system requires you to betray yourself. Nzinga chose the harder road, not because it guaranteed victory, but because it preserved the soul of her people. From that point forward, nothing about her rule would be easy, but everything about it would be clear. She had drawn the line, and once drawn, it could not be erased. Exile strips a person of every illusion. When Nzinga was forced out of Ndongo, she did not leave with ceremony. There was no procession, no farewell speeches, no guarantees of return. There was only distance, danger, and the knowledge that her enemies believed she was finished. The Portuguese installed a ruler who would obey them. They believed legitimacy could be manufactured. They believed resistance would collapse once the crown was removed. They underestimated what Nzinga had already learned. She went to Matamba not as a guest, but as a survivor. The land did not wait for her with open arms. She had no inherited authority there, no automatic loyalty, only a reputation and a responsibility she refused to abandon. Nzinga rebuilt power from the ground up. She forged alliances, others called unthinkable. She worked with warriors who had no homeland left, people the world had already discarded. She did not ask them to forget who they were. She gave them a reason to stand together. Her rule in Matamba was not gentle. But it was clear. Loyalty was earned through protection. Discipline was enforced through purpose. She did not promise safety. She promised meaning. For 30 years, Nzinga did not disappear. She fought when she had to. She withdrew when survival demanded it. She used time as a weapon. While empires rushed, she endured. When the Dutch entered the region, Nzinga did not confuse opportunity with trust. She aligned strategically, not emotionally. She forced European powers to turn against each other, buying space for her people to breathe. This was not a war meant to be won quickly. It was a war meant to be outlasted. Many who hear this story understand that kind of resistance. Not dramatic victory, but refusal to vanish. Holding ground long enough for the next generation to rise stronger. Nzinga lived long enough to see her enemies change strategies, leaders, and excuses. She became something empires fear deeply. Not a rebel to be crushed, but a constant presence that would not break. When she finally grew old, it was not because the struggle ended. It was because she had survived it. Nzinga taught the world that survival, when guided by dignity, becomes its own form of power. And sometimes, staying is the most radical act of all. Nzinga did not die on a battlefield. She was not captured. She was not broken. She lived into old age, long enough to see her enemies grow tired, change names, change flags, and change stories, long enough to know that her survival itself had become an argument they could not defeat. When she finally passed, it was quietly, and almost immediately. The world she had held at bay rushed forward. The slave trade expanded. Control tightened. The land she protected was pulled into what would later be called Angola. Some might call that failure. But history, when told honestly, knows better. Nzinga was never trying to create a world without enemies. She was holding a line. She was buying time. She was standing long enough for memory to survive. After her death, her people did not forget how to stand. They remembered that there had once been a woman who refused the ground, who said there were no slaves in her kingdom, who taught empires that African dignity was not a request. That is why her name still lives. In Angola, she is called the mother of the nation. Her name is spoken in streets, in prayers, in stories passed down where books could not reach, in places far from her homeland, among descendants carried across oceans. Her spirit appears again and again as strength, as refusal, as quiet authority. Nzinga is not remembered because she won every battle. She is remembered because she never surrendered her posture. For those listening today, especially those who have lived long enough to see history rewritten more than once, her story lands with weight. You have seen promises broken. You have seen systems change names but keep the same shape. You have seen how easy it is for the world to forget those who stood firm without applause. Nzinga reminds us that legacy is not built by comfort. It is built by choices repeated when no one is watching. If there is one thing to carry forward from her life, it is this: standing straight is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is simply consistent. Stories like hers are why African history cannot be reduced to dates and defeat. They are history legends, passed mouth to ear, not for spectacle, but for survival. They are historical facts, carried in the body as much as the mind. They are part of Black history, not because they are tragic, but because they are enduring. Some people listen to stories to be entertained. Others listen to history for sleep. But stories like this are meant to wake something up. Because as long as her story is told, Nzinga has not left. And as long as we remember how she stood, we will remember how to stand ourselves.